Welcome. I'm Professor Tracy Cooper of Temple University and a member of the Save Venice Board, Projects Committee, and Educational Resources Committee. And I'd like to thank all of our webinar attendees for joining us today. And a special thank you for Save Venice members for supporting all of the work that we do. Today, we have Dr. Sheila Barker presenting, and I would like to thank her for her work, the last in the spring 2022 Education and Enrichment series. We've had an active spring. For example, Save Venice had sessions presented at the Renaissance Society of America conference in Dublin recently, which focused on Save Venice's Women Artists of Venice program, for which I am proud to head the research track. The work today, then, that you will see is something that we hope to form part of an ongoing series of works that have included some of our past webinars, and I urge that you take a look at the Save Venice website for those. I'd like to introduce our speaker now, Dr. Sheila Barker. Sheila is founding director of the Jane Fortune Research Program on Women Artists at the Medici Archive Project and adjunct associate professor of the history of art at the University of Pennsylvania. Having received her doctorate in art history in 2002 from Columbia University, Dr. Barker is specialized both in the art and the medicine of Southern Europe in the 15th through 18th centuries. Her archival research has greatly expanded knowledge of pioneering women artists, and you can join her for some of her observations other than today's lecture on her very active blog and speaker program for the Medici Archive Project. Her archival research has brought to light new knowledge about pioneering women artists, and she is the leading expert on Artemisia Gentileschi, Giovanna Garzoni, Lucrezia Quistelli, and Teresa Berenice Vitelli. In 2020, she curated a major exhibition for the Uffizi Galleries in Florence titled The Immensity of the Universe in the Art of Giovanna Garzoni, La grandezza dell'universo nell'arte di Giovanna Garzoni. This received glowing reviews in the Burlington Magazine and Apollo. And in 2022, her monograph entitled Artemisia Gentileschi was co-published by Lund Humphreys and Getty Publications for the series Illuminating Women Artists, an important real force in making women artists visual to a wider public. I would like to ask any of the attendees at today's lecture to be free to submit any questions for Dr. Barker, who has kindly agreed to answer them after her presentation. And if you would put these in the Q&A. I would like to now welcome Dr. Barker to present for us today on a topic that I know we're all eager to learn more about. Dr. Barker.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. What a pleasure to be here. I think, well, as some people know, I was supposed to have been a guest of Save Venice in Dublin, giving a 10-minute presentation, but instead here I am on Zoom giving a 40-minute presentation. And between the two, I'm just as happy with this situation because It's a luxury to be able to speak for 40 minutes. And I really am also thrilled about having so many listeners today, because reactions and responses are always welcome and so useful for the research process. And thank you to everyone for being willing to look at my screen share from Florence. And it's so wonderful to be able to have this collaboration between the Medici Archive Project and Save Venice. I'm sure it won't be the last time. I'm going to try to screen share. I've been practicing. Oh, and I also want to thank everyone who's been, Laura and Chris, who've been so helpful in putting this together, and our sponsors for today's program. Okay. Okay, so I hope you can see my first slide. Is that the case?
Looks great. Perfect.
Okay. I am going to keep it in this mode because I may want to move around my slides a bit, but we'll see. So as you can see from my title here, I am very concerned with Giovanna Garzoni in Venice, and of all of the works that I've littered the background with. Probably only the one in the top left was made in Venice, but I don't think that that's the point. As you'll see from my talk today, I think Venice had a lasting impact on her. And I know for a lot of you out there, you know exactly what I mean about that lasting impact. Venice has never been considered a major hub for the early development of still life painting, a genre that began to gain currency in Italy around 1600. It is therefore all the more remarkable that one of the greatest 17th century innovators in the still life genre was a woman artist with important ties to Venice, Giovanna Garzoni, the most famous miniature painter of her century. These ties between Giovanna Garzoni and Venice are the focus of my talk today. I will argue that we should look not only at the artistic training that Giovanna received in Venice, but also to her extra artistic experiences there, if we are to understand the forma mentis, the mindset of this artist, an artist who gave new creative potential to the still life genre by treating images of flowers, vegetables, and fruits, sometimes insects too, or other little furry creatures that wander in and out of the scene, a status as if they were human portraits, for they not only appear true to life, but also imbued with a soul, I would argue. They look as if they wanted to speak and express their individual personalities, characters, momentary thoughts even. As Mary Garrett demonstrated in her excellent essay for the 2020 exhibition catalog that was mentioned a second ago, these still lifes can be, the fruits in them can be funny, they can be sexually provocative. They always, however, give the viewer a sense of delight and well-being. I'm going to push a little bit beyond that a very important essay that Mary wrote with today's talk. So I hope you'll indulge me there. I love the sultry, drunken languor of these two artichokes, their lanky limbs flung wide. They're unable to lift their heavy heads. In this one, the cherries. There's this extreme contrast. Look at the giddy excitement and the nervous jostling of these gregarious and chatty cherries. I'll come back to these still lives and others later to explain their magic power on the viewer. But first, I'd like to offer what I think and what I hope will be the fullest account to date of what Venice meant to Giovanna. Venice as a nationality. It is not certain where Giovanna was born, since her birth record has still not been located. Tentatively, art historians have placed her origins in the Marchigian town of Ascoli Piceno around 1600. Their evidence has been a declaration that Giovanna made in her will, which was written near the end of her life. 1666 was when it was written. She died in 1670. And this will inspired the inscription of the funerary marker that she paid for himself. The inscription was composed by the Marchigian painter Giuseppe Ghezzi. No coincidence there. However, I should point out that in the 17th century, it seems to have been traditional practice for a woman's nationality to be tied not to the circumstantial place of her birth, nor even a man's in most cases, but rather to the father's nationality. Giovanna's father was Gian Giacomo Garzoni, and sorry for standardizing the pronunciation rather than using the Venetian dialect. He was a perfume maker from Venice, who had spent a few years in Ascoli Piceno for sure. So by this standard, at least, she was Venetian. For what it matters, her mother, Elisabetta, or Isabetta, was also the daughter of a Venetian father. And so she too probably should be considered Venetian. During Giovanna Garzoni's lifetime, confusion reigned over the question of her nationality. She is never said to be a Venetian in the various documents I've seen from her life. But I have seen her mistakenly referred to as being from Genoa, Lucca, L'Aquila, Flanders, and even France. These decidedly dissimilar places, only one of which she can actually be connected to, that is France, has led me to wonder whether our artists might have engaged actively in fostering these false impressions. Was she perhaps attempting to dress up her modest Marchigian origins with an affected accent or something like that? Or, as I am now coming to believe, and I hope you'll agree with me by the end of today's talk, was she trying to deflect attention from her Venetian past because she did not want people to try to pry into her turbulent personal history in that city? Whatever the motivation, there may have been a kernel of truth to her affected exoticism due to a family tree that shows she did have a noble French ancestor. Her mother, Isabetta Gaia, was the daughter of Niccolò, a Venetian goldsmith, who first moved to Ferrara and then Ascoli Piceno. Niccolò Gaia, in turn, was the son of Piero Gaia, according to this family tree. And this Piero Gaia was supposedly a baron of Montpellier in France. But I haven't determined that there are any barons of Montpellier, so I'm very confused by the reference. And I hope to elucidate that situation soon with more research. A Venetian training in oil painting. Giovanna and Matteo, her older brother by 3 years, who later became a soldier, both studied painting from a young age. Giovanna's apprenticeship probably began, as did her brother's, at a young age when she was still in Ascoli Piceno, under the guidance of her maternal uncle, the very, 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 very minor Venetian painter Pietro Gaia, himself a former student of the highly successful Venetian master Jacopo Negretti, better known as Palma the Younger, the leading proponent of Tintoretto's style at the beginning of the 17th century. After this initiation, Garzoni's family moved to Venice in the parish of Santi Apostoli, And thus here in Venice, Garzoni continued her study of oil painting, almost certainly under Palma directly. It does not surprise me that Giovanna, as a female, would have been accepted into such a prestigious workshop as that of Palma il Giovane. Although the Adriatic capital had no tradition of female court artists, as opposed to, say, Florence or London or Madrid, the city nonetheless had nurtured the careers of many late 16th century female painters, both professionals and amateurs, including Marietta Robusti, Irene da Spilimbergo, Gasparina Pittoni, Bernardina di Zuan Mathio, Campaspe Giancarli, and Chiara Barotari. Many more, in fact, than Bologna was doing at that same time, but just about as many as Florence. Now, while a teenager in Venice, Giovanna closely emulated the style of the second teacher of hers, Palma il Giovane. This can be seen in her earliest surviving artwork and also her first known commission, namely a large oil painting of St. Andrew, which I'm showing in the far left of this particular slide, measuring 158 centimeters by 115, and it is signed prominently Giovanna Garzoni, F for Fecit. Now in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, it was originally displayed. Let me advance the slide here. Among a series of 12 similarly sized paintings depicting the apostles, which used to decorate the upper tier of Venice's no longer extant Church of the Santissimo Salvatore, built within the hospital complex for syphilis patients known as the Ospedale degli Incurabili, now the site of Venice's Accademia di Belle Arti, I believe. I'm not good with Venetian architectural history. These paintings were commissioned from various masters in 1616, when Giovanna, born around 1600, would have been 16 years old. The rest of the paintings in this series of the paintings of apostles were made by some of the most highly regarded Venetian painters of that era, all of whom were much older than Giovanna, including Domenico Tintoretto, Andrea Vicentino, Maffeo Verona, and Palma il Giovane himself. So what you're seeing here is the plan of the church, and you can see it has an oval shape with only 5 altars, but these apostles, the series of apostles, was going to go, or was above the level of the altars all around the church. And here, just for fun, I showed you the ceiling painting by Padovanino. And let me go back to this slide so that you can see the work that Giovanna Garzoni executed. And of the 2 by Palma il Giovane, the one on the left is his own contribution to that exact same cycle of the apostles. And you can see that she's not too far off from her master, even though he's at the height of his career and she's just starting out at age 16 or 17. And on the right is a work by Palma for another church that clearly Giovanna Garzoni has seen and whose composition she has adapted. The fact that at her tender age, she had been commissioned to carry out one of the 12 works as an independent master is compelling evidence that in the highly competitive Venetian art market, Giovanna's talent, young as she was highly regarded. Venetian music. At the same time that Garzoni was studying oil painting in Venice, the young prodigy was also studying music quite seriously. In fact, it is in the guise of a musician that she carried out this self-portrait, perhaps made around 1617. I used to think it was 1620-ish, but I'm going by the look of her face. Not sure. It was a little before the making of this portrait, perhaps as early as 1615, when she was 15 years old, that Giovanna visited the Medici court in Florence, having been invited there by the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Maria Magdalena von Habsburg, not as a painter, but as a musician. We don't yet know the string of introductions and intermediaries that prompted this invitation to visit the Medici court. I suspect her father had a good deal of influence there. He was a pharmacist who was quite a bit of a busybody, who got in trouble with the Holy Office once for doing a semi-public demonstration of how he, were he an enemy of the Venetian Republic, would attack the fortress of Palma. And somehow he had in his possession secret designs for it. He also had lots of relazioni and other sensitive material that usually passed through diplomatic channels, including a lot of letters of the emperor. I say all of this because somehow her father seems to have known a lot more and had more greater connections than one might expect from a pharmacist. In any case, however she got there, while she was in Florence, Giovanna may have been introduced to two women artists who were then working at the Medici court, Arcangela Palladini, who did not live very much longer, unfortunately, and Artemisia Gentileschi, who a decade later would again cross paths with Giovanna, this time in Venice. A polymathic preparation for a future court painter. When Garzoni appeared before the Grand Duchess Maria Maddalena von Habsburg in Florence, the young girl not only played string instruments, and we know from the self-portrait that she was particularly proud of her viola da gamba skills. That's what she's got here, and she has signed the instrument on the neck. She also sang. She played several stringed instruments for this performance, and she also sang in 3 different styles. And as if that weren't enough, there we go. Here's some of the descriptions. This is the historical description of that visit. As if that weren't enough, she gave live demonstrations of calligraphic writing, and she revealed her skill in the art form that would later be her métier, the painted miniature, carried out with pigments such as watercolor, gouache, or tempera on a support of either parchment or vellum. Her gift to the Archduchess of a painted miniature representing her namesake Saint Mary Magdalene is unfortunately untraced, but the documentation of her presentation of this work to the Grand Duchess means that Giovanna was already well versed in this art of the miniature well before her marriage. And I am underlining this point because some scholars have wrongly presumed that Giovanna learned to make miniatures from her husband, about whom we will hear shortly. And I want to show you, yes, some of the calligraphy. We'll get back to that very soon. So who then taught Garzoni the art of miniature painting? It is certain from her timeline that she learned that art in Venice, as you've just heard, because she arrived to the Florentine court for that visit with a miniature in hand. And I suspect that somehow she managed to see some works left behind that in the city of Venice by the witty and extremely skillful 16th century Flemish miniaturist Joris Hoefnagel, who lived from 1542 to 1600, and who spent some time in Venice in 1577 to 1578. Sounds like a horrible time to visit Venice, year of a terrible plague, completing his illustrated catalog of all known animals. The comparison I'm showing you now is not from that illustrated catalog. Instead, it's from a work of calligraphy, an earlier work of calligraphy that he illustrated now at the Getty. But I thought it was such a lovely comparison. The groupings of all of these busy little conversational groupings of all of these animals and fruits and such in a small space that it bared demonstrating to you. But these sheets are examples of what Joris Hufnagel was working on when he passed through Italy and spent a long time in Venice. So she may have seen some sheet that escaped from his collection, or perhaps someone made a copy of it, or perhaps there's a missing link. Someone who saw Hufnagel copied it or was influenced by it, and Giovanna may have learned from that person. We do know from her own writings, of course, a little bit about her study of calligraphy. In fact, it is her very own calligraphic writings in which she tells us that she learned the art of calligraphy in Venice from an otherwise unknown figure named Giacomo Rogni. I've also wondered if perhaps she misspelled it. Was it Bogni? I'm not sure, but Rogni seems to be a very rare name in those parts. I'm asking for help. But as Aoife Cosgrove, my colleague, has discovered, she also learned from books on calligraphy, such as this one that I'm showing you now, the Spiegel der Schreibkünste by Jan van de Velde, which was published in Rotterdam in 1605. Obviously, a copy made its way to Venice, because look at Giovanna Garzoni's work, almost exactly identical to the practice page I showed you a second ago. Through the practice of calligraphy, Garzoni attained unparalleled coordination and control over the graphic instrument, as is evident from her own book of calligraphy, the Libro dei Caratteri Cancellereschi Corsivi, that's at the Biblioteca Accademia di San Luca. There's the title page from it. Some of whose sheets certainly must date from around the time of her visit, meaning more or less the time of her Florentine years. Excuse me, she only had a short time in Florence at this point, her Venetian years. This virtuosic handling of the quill and ink was no doubt an adjuvant skill for her microscopic scale miniatures, works that required impeccable precision with no margin for error, because with the miniature, there can be no erasing and no overpainting. It is also worth noting that calligraphy had a performative aspect. Let me go back to this slide. Imagine watching imagine feeling the building excitement as you watched Giovanna draw this design at the Medici court, for example. She only could have begun in two spots because this is one single continuous line. She either could have begun in a little tiny spiral to the lower bottom right, or a little spiral to in the middle of the mast. So as you would have watched that white paper fill with this continuous sinuous line with the quill never lifting from the paper, you would have seen appear before your eyes like magic, this craft sailing through the foaming sea. Finally, if we take a moment to consider the content of these calligraphic samples that she made in her childhood, we see that she composed each sample for a specific recipient, and that these texts reveal a remarkably sophisticated concettismo, or literary wit. In other words, our teenage artist was more than just literate, she was a competent wordsmith. And she may have gotten that from her father because, as I've just mentioned, he had quite a collection of papers and letters. The fact that Giovanna studied a diverse range of arts and skills rather than focusing just on one, not only points to her astonishing natural aptitude, but also to the probable motivation for her father's decision to expose her to many of the skills pertaining to the humanist education of the noble class. It would seem to me that her parents, perhaps after realizing her extraordinary potential early on, had hoped that she would enter the court of a grand noblewoman. By the time she turned 20, she had become a perfectly charming woman and a darling of Venetian society. It was said of her by Claudio Ridolfi in his biography of her future husband, Tiberio Tinelli, that she enjoyed, while still unmarried, regular social gatherings, accustomed to the pleasure of entertaining her admirers and dear ones, her amorevoli, by making little portrait miniatures and by playing her musical instruments and singing. I would not be surprised, in fact, if Giovanna, as the beloved star of her cultural salon, participated in refined parlor games, such as the one made famous in late 16th century Siena and described recently by historian George McClure, whereby designs for medals, just drawn designs for medals, were circulated representing male and female guests at one of these salottieri, and everyone at the party would take their turn circulating the drawings and inventing a witty device for the imagined reverse of these medals. So I'm sure, there were all kinds of perfectly delightful and innocent cultural entertainments that Giovanna was the center of. There was one catch to all of Giovanna's sweet and delightful prominence in Venetian society as its leading female prodigy. The career goals set for her by her parents required chastity, since noble women typically chose their female entourage with strict concerns for morality, or concerns for strict morality. To keep Giovanna on the straight and narrow ever since her youth, Giovanna's family had warned her against getting pregnant. They even had, I believe that they set this up, but they even had a local soothsayer confirm this by prophesizing that if Giovanna were to become pregnant and give birth, she would die. Similarly, her parents did not want her to marry so soon, at least not someone from the artisan class. Nevertheless, all of this careful planning was overturned by the powers of the heart. It's an enthralling but tragic story we're about to hear. It was brought to light in 2004 by Francesca Bottacin, the biographer, the great monograph writer on Tiberio Tinelli, expert on Tiberio Tinelli. And it is based on the records of a trial she found in the Venetian archives. Fittingly for our still life painter, her romance began with a flower and a fruit. You'll know what I'm talking about pretty soon. In 1621, Giovanna fell under the spell of the portrait painter Tiberio Tinelli, 13 years her senior. He fell under her spell too, perhaps harder. Tiberio's version of their sad story is told by our 17th century artist biographer, Claudio Ridolfi. According to Ridolfi, Tiberio was enchanted by a young girl of a pure and chaste nature, and while visiting her, he proposed marriage to her in expectation of all the pleasures of paradise, and the girl, wishing to escape her father's tyranny, was inclined to consider marriage and even had her mother's sympathy. Now I interrupt Ridolfi's version to add a very sweet detail that emerges from their divorce proceedings. During his suit of young Giovanna, Tiberio sent her a sweet smelling citron flower, like a rose, like a lemon flower, or something from the citrus group. And our Giovanna reciprocated that sweet gesture by sending Tiberio a citron fruit with the encouraging message, "Our flower has produced a fruit." Ridolfi continues, and he tells us that at first it seemed the courtship could not proceed because Tiberio had learned that Giovanna had taken, quote, "a vow of perpetual virginity, as she had complete trust in the soothsayer who had predicted she would die in childbirth." Yet even this detail did not dissuade Tiberio, and the couple married on the 17th of July in 1622 in a church in Cannereggio, San Canziano, near the Garzoni family home. Very recently, Fiorella Pagotto discovered the record of the dowry Giovanna Garzoni brought to the marriage, revealing that it was not cash, but that it consisted rather in her valuable possessions, including her personal collection of musical instruments. And among these, a theorbo, a lute, a harpsichord, very expensive, and an organ, extremely expensive, as well as many miniatures, presumably by her own hand. The dowry of 1622 thus confirms not only how seriously engaged Giovanna was in her musical pursuits, but also that she had certainly conquered the art of miniature painting well before her marriage to Tiberio. Ridolfi continues his story. Quote, "The marriage was arranged in accordance with this vow of chastity, and Giovanna went to live with Tiberio, now we know in the Corte di Cazen, and everything was peaceful as long as Giovanna's father was sharing in the household profits and running his son-in-law's affairs. And of course, under these circumstances, they began fighting all the time, father and son-in-law, over who held the authority in these matters. Perhaps it all could have been solved simply by dividing the assets up, but the father-in-law, unwilling to give up his daughter and feeling quite bold and smart as usual, he assailed Tiberio with threats and weapons, and Tiberio would have defended himself easily. But instead, he did not fight back out of respect for the woman he was crazy for. Giovanna herself felt deprived when her jealous husband, Tiberio, impeded her from carrying on with her circle of friends and her cultural salon. She began to listen to her brother, Matteo, who persuaded her to leave Tiberio. He did this by continually describing her life as a perpetual enslavement and a loss of freedom, la libertà perduta. And one day when her husband was away, Giovanna secretly returned to her father's house. That's the end of Ridolfi's version. 8 months later, in the spring of 1623, they were all called before the inquisitors of the Holy Office for a trial labeled Tiberio Tinelli for having seduced a girl by means of witchcraft. The preceding story was, of course, Tiberio's point of view, as he would have told to Ridolfi. But it's now time to hear the version of the events as recounted by Giovanna's family during the trial, a trial Gian Giacomo Garzoni had instigated so that, quote, his unhappy daughter could be freed from such a horrendous and diabolical martyrdom. And by means, and he charged that his son-in-law had used diabolical mind control, diabolica immaginazione, and by means of spells and witchcraft, he had convinced the girl to break the vow of chastity that she had made to God. That was the father's speech. Giovanna and others feared that the citron flower and the citron fruit that I described earlier had been deployed by Tiberio in spells to control her mind and to make him want to marry him. Tiberio told her after their marriage to take good care of the citron because it was the reason she had become his wife. Giovanna's father had wanted to steal said citron and take it to a wise woman or local witch of some sort in order to have the spell removed from it, but he was foiled in trying to get his hands on the fruit. Another such spell had been put into effect with the help of a corrupt, womanizing local priest who was also a confidant and client of Tiberio's. This priest, Giulio Pietra, brought a human skull to Giovanna's house and convinced Giovanna to kiss it by telling her it was the skull of a female virgin saint now in heaven and that it should be venerated. In fact, the whole family of Garzonis kissed the skull. The priest also brought Tiberio's own collection of prohibited books on sorcery and necromancy to Giovanna's house, telling her that they could be dangerous to her if she had no experience with witchcraft. Tiberio himself put a further spell on Giovanna, all according to testimonies given by the father and his household, by giving Giovanna a diamond engagement ring that, even though it was the correct size, had the effect of paralyzing Giovanna's whole arm and causing her intense pain and tremors, such that she could no longer make her art and she was just in agony. According to witnesses, Tiberio promised to have someone remove the spell from the ring so that Giovanna's father would stop complaining about the cursed ring. According to Giovanna's father, upon moving in with Tiberio, the girl had, quote, suffered from a lack of food and clothing, and she had to endure vile behavior, threats, exhausting labor demands, sleepless nights, and slavery, schiavitù. She had mentioned such things to a priest of the Church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo in the course of making her confession, saying that she planned to flee to her father's house. However, this priest betrayed her trust and told Tiberio of his wife's intentions, and from then on, Giovanna was too afraid to ever go back to confession anymore or to talk to anyone about her problems. In fact, she doesn't give any testimony during the trial. It's always her father or other members of the household. Although the Garzoni family had petitioned the inquisitors to grant Giovanna a divorce, which would have entitled her to financial support from Tiberio for the rest of her life, what they obtained instead was a simple annulment, which spared Tiberio of the onerous cost of a divorce. Tiberio did nonetheless suffer because of this ordeal. He ceased to paint for an entire year in 1623, and ever after, he remained single. He would spend the next 16 years of his life living with his mother, unable or unwilling to pursue such important career opportunities as an invitation to work at the court of the King of France. He said no, and he died of heart problems at the age, and a fever at the age of 52 in 1639. The liberated woman artist. Giovanna was more resilient, although she never remarried either. By 1625, she had a presence in the growing Venetian market for miniatures. Made in Venice that year is her signed and dated portrait of a gentleman now at the Stiftung Historische Bezemelingen in The Hague. The man in the image shows the secret of his burning heart, which is inscribed with his lover's initials. He looks vaguely British. Perhaps he was Daniel Nice, Charles I art agent in Venice. Don't know. In any case, Giovanna was clearly in touch again with her cherished cultural salon, meeting foreigners and others with a passion for the arts. One of those foreigners was surely Artemisia Gentileschi, with whom she traveled to Rome and Naples in 1630 to work for the Viceroy of Spain. And I should point out that at this moment, when they were together in 1630, both of them were estranged from their husbands. Of course, Giovanna's marriage was annulled. Artemisia would soon totally lose track of her husband, and she was engaged in an affair at the time. And both of them surely felt they had been wronged, and had this incredibly remarkable experience of autonomy, working autonomously. From Naples, Giovanna then went to Turin as the miniaturist of the Duchess of Savoy, Christine de France, beginning in 1632. At the Duchess's death, Giovanna then accepted a position at the court of King Charles I of England, where again, she meets up with Artemisia Gentileschi. And then shortly afterwards, as turmoil took over the court of Charles I, Giovanna headed for Paris around 1639. At the same time, her husband former husband Tiberio has just passed away, for Cardinal de Richelieu, whence she accepted a position at the Medici court. Finally, back to the Medici court, more than 30 years after her first visit. And here she made portrait miniatures, a wide range of still life images, genre scenes, miniature copies of full-size masterpieces. Giovanna's copy of Raphael is on the right here. Designs for stone inlay tables and fans. Now, the fan is not by Giovanna Garzoni. I would love to find a fan, an extant fan painted by Giovanna Garzoni, but I can't. This was something I found on the internet, probably from the late 17th or early 18th century. And she also made liturgical textiles, So at this point, I'd like to revisit the initial question about Giovanna's Venetian heritage and the characteristics that make her still lives so lively and captivating. This was the heyday. This period in Florence was the heyday of her still life production. Between 1642 and 1651, she made 20 portrait-like representations of fruits and vegetables placed in dishes, all for Grand Duke Ferdinando II of the House of Medici, and always basing her paintings on the study of real objects and living exemplars, and I feel succeeding brilliantly in making her images seem to have more of the spirit of animate life than even the real objects themselves. I would suggest that Giovanna perceived these vegetables differently than you or I. Because as a believer of magic, she accepted the principles of animism, as did her family members, her husband, and even the inquisitors, apparently. Although the complaints lodged during the court trial may have been exaggerated by her father, there is no doubt that Giovanna Garzoni's family believed witchcraft harnessed real powers. Giovanna's brother Mattio, for example, had been questioned by the Holy Office just a couple years before her marriage to Tiberio regarding his recourse to a magical healer named Serena in order to be cured of a disease that, according to him, 2 physicians had failed to cure, and which Mattio, and so had 2 priests, and which Mattio therefore concluded was the result of a hex or a spell, and that not even the priest of Santo Stefano or San Francesco could cure it. The magic that Tiberio and other Venetians practiced had as its fundamental logic the idea that certain inanimate objects, particularly stones, plants, and animal substances, had inner powers, virtu, or of occult properties. And they could be infused with spirits, these objects, through incantations and other witchcraft, this way gaining power over the things around them. This way the objects could gain power over the things around them. I suppose that as Giovanna Garzoni drew the citrus flowers in many of her still lifes, this is a classic one from the Getty, but just to go back here, you can see some of the gelsomini or citrus flowers in other works as well. But these are clearly orange flowers, not gelsomini, not jasmine, but orange flowers, or flowers that have the oil of neroli. And also, whenever she drew citrus fruits, citron fruits, and that's what we see here. This is a bowl of citrons as well as some limes, laboriously giving them shape and form with her veils of almost microscopic dots. She must have contemplated the power they once had over her own heart and all the tragedy that they led to. However, this time she was the magician casting the spell, using her acute vision and her invisible brushwork, and perhaps even pigments made from the essences of plants. Jacopo Ligozzi had such a recipe, in order to transpose their vegetable souls onto her parchment and bind them there, as a spell might, with her line and her color. Like a young girl under the spell of her first romance, we, the viewer, cannot help but fall in love with Giovanna's charmed world. As an artist, Giovanna helps us recognize the inherent and peculiar charm of each natural thing she depicted. Her imagery becomes a visual analog, excuse me, to the many powers of plants, their medicinal healing effects, their poisonous potentials, their nourishing sustenance, their surprising taste, their fascinating forms, and intoxicating perfumes. Her ability to infuse a vivid sense of those powers in her miniatures helps to explain why, in the years, let me advance the slide. Why in the years after Garzoni's death, the Medici Grand Duchess, whose picture appears on the far right here, Duchess Vittoria della Rovere, a Marquisan, by the way, from Urbino, gathered 38 of Garzoni's miniatures dispersed in various Medici collections and brought them all together on the walls of a room she had constructed for her most precious treasures, a kind of Wunderkammer called the Stanza dell'Aurora in her residence, the Villa del Poggio Imperiale in Florence. That Wunderkammer no longer exists, but for the exhibition in 2020, we used an inventory to reconstruct the room with the a drawing blown up, full large scale, to recreate a fresco that was there. And some of the objects, many, the room was crammed full of hundreds and hundreds of things. And here, Garzoni's artworks were displayed in this special room together with many other objects, all representing the pinnacle of what could be achieved, either by humankind or by nature. Rare pieces of Chinese porcelain, small bronzes, portrait miniatures, all made by men, or humans. But in this room, there were also treasured, fashioned from the materials made by nature. The materials that were believed at that time to have magical or alexipharmic properties, such as ivory, rhinoceros horn, moose hooves, nautilus shells, semi-precious stones, coconuts. There, amidst some of the most wondrous and magically powerful objects on the planet, Garzoni's miniatures took their rightful place of honor. Here's my last section. A treasured relic of her Venetian past. Such intricately observed and meticulously detailed works were no longer within Garzoni's physical capacity due to a vision problem that affected her in 1659. And so in her later years, the aging artist, now living in Rome, worked solely in textile art using decoupage techniques. She died in 1670, and in an inventory of her possessions, we see that she owned many jewels, but she also had 3 prints in her possession. Here's her will. She had 2 by Albrecht Dürer. And these are the ones I believe to have identified correctly. But she also had 1 by Tintoretto, the Great Crucifixion. Certainly one of the most important Venetian prints ever made. And so in a sense, we could say that the magic of Venice and the magic of Venetian art stayed with Giovanna till the end of her days. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really riveting presentation, Sheila, and far more drama than I had expected. Goodness. I do have a question that I think would be interesting to some of our listeners, and that is, where can we see the works by Giovanna Garzoni in the United States? You mentioned the citrons at the Getty, and I wonder if you could let us know about others.
So yes, at Oberlin, I can skip up to my, I'm not screen sharing anymore, we won't go back. But at Oberlin, they've recently made a purchase for their museum of the fantastically interesting and beautifully executed portrait miniature of Zaga Christ, an Ethiopian who traveled through Europe after having converted to Catholicism, trying to get support to overthrow his brother from the Ethiopian throne. But it's clearly a work that gave Giovanna an opportunity to talk with Zaga Christ, because on the back of the miniature, she has written out she's signed her name in cursive as she normally did, but then she's written it out phonetically in Ethiopic script, which she could only have learned from him through some kind of a conversation. And it's just gives me goosebumps to talk about it. It's so thrilling that she had such curiosity about anything and everything and didn't miss an opportunity to learn. Let me think.
Size are her miniatures generally? One of our board members who's attending was curious.
I didn't hear what size are they? The portrait miniatures are often meant to be carried on the body in a form of in jewelry, so in a pendant. So they are often the smallest, and they might be 3 inches high sometimes. Some of the other portrait miniatures were meant to go on the wall, and they're so 8 inches. And some of the miniatures are really the size of a standard sheet of paper. We call them miniatures not because of size. We now use the word miniature to mean very small, but the root to miniare or minio comes from a Latin term for a red paint, I think a mercury-based paint that was a typical paint for a person working on parchment. So when we talk about miniatures, they're never going to be larger than a piece of parchment paper. That is your natural limit. And parchment comes from the back of a sheep or a small calf. So yeah, the size can vary. But her virtuosity is in her the matrix of dots and small, tiny directional lines that she paints. She absolutely must have used a lens, and it's astonishing the degree of precision and detail with which she worked.
Yes, that's something where the texture of the parchment can also contribute to that sense of stippling, almost micro stippling, really.
Right, because you can sometimes see, if they're not prepared well, the pores of the animal's skin. But another reason that the parchment is so nice is, compared to paper, it glows, it reflects a lot more of the light. And Giovanna was really imitating in many of her still life works the kinds of subjects and compositions that had only been done with oil paint. So when she took that way of looking at flowers and fruits and put it on parchment, white glowing parchment, it was like taking nature out of the dark and into the daylight. It suddenly had a new glow to it.
And you were saying also, I interrupted you, as far as other examples of her work available.
I have just forgotten. There's something I'm embarrassed about. There are a couple in private hands. And there is one at the Orator Gallery in New York, a bowl of figs. And I apologize to whatever venerable institution owns anything I'm forgetting.
Well, I just think that is a real telling aspect, that something as clearly appreciated as her works were, quartz, for example, and as accomplished as she clearly is, that they aren't more widely available in collections, although I will compliment you in the kind of work that you've done together with your other colleagues, but particularly I think with the Uffizi show. A recent comment I saw that suggested that the reason to come to the exhibition by her hand, Artemisia Gentileschi and Women Artists in Italy, 1800, that began at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, is now at Detroit and about to close its run. Might have been the namesake in the title, but one went away being really amazed by the work of Giovanna Garzoni as a real star. So, I think that's really something that resonates too with another question one of our listeners had, which is how far in Europe did the knowledge of her works extend at the time of Garzoni? You've mentioned London and France, as well as you had the other centers in Italy itself. But what would you suggest? Was she someone who was so well known at courts, in part because her work was used diplomatically as well?
I really appreciate that question, because I hadn't ever thought about the issue before. And actually, now that I consider it, even though she did work at so many different courts, her work, as far as I know, was not, or rarely, if ever, presented as a gift in diplomatic exchanges. And I can only imagine that her patrons loved them so much that they guarded them jealously and did not give them away, because of course they would be so easy to transport. They're small. But we don't have any records of her works being sent as gifts. I'm kind of saying that off the cuff, but yeah, I don't think it's because they didn't lend themselves to that. I do think that it was because the individuals across Europe, Charles I, the most powerful art collector on the planet next to Philip IV in Spain, they're vying, and Richelieu, and then the Medici, who perhaps weren't as powerful but spent everything they had on art in a way. Really, the creme de la creme of Europe's patrons were vying for Garzoni, and she did die quite a wealthy woman because of that.
I see one of our scholarly commentators who is also a participant in our panels at RSA, Bet Bone, known for her work on the women artists of Bologna, notes that there is an album of watercolor studies of plants at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington.
Yes, of course. I knew I was going to really kick myself. Yes, that is one of the most extraordinary things in Washington, D.C., where I am right now. I can't believe I forgot it. And yes, I encourage anyone who has the chance to get out to Dumbarton Oaks to make the reservation with the head of the library there, Rare Books, and see it in person. But if you can't, Harvard Libraries has it on their catalog. So if you go to Harvard University Libraries, of which Dumbarton Oaks is a part, and you look for Giovanna Garzoni's Book of Plants, you can see incredibly high resolution images, really knock your socks off resolution, and they can all be downloaded for free. So thank you, Harvard, for that.
Yeah, we appreciate open access to these incredible visual treasures. And one of the other questions from the audience had to do with why she isn't better known. And I think, as a woman artist who made these kinds of works that were rather intimate in many ways, as you pointed out, was known by the highest form of collectors in Europe. But at the same time, because of the nature of albums of miniatures and works on paper and parchment, they're often not displayed, and frequently, if there's an album, only one image will be actually printed in trying to show representation of the collection. So this kind of digital access that's very accurate and high quality is going to help, I think, that kind of recognition. Sheila, thank you so much for your talk today. I'm looking forward, of course, to more of our interaction, and really can't thank you enough. So I would also like to thank our audience for attending today, and we so appreciate the kind of support that we've had and the incredibly high quality of speakers for the education series that have spoken on various women artists of Venice. It's less than a year ago that Save Venice launched the Women Artists of Venice, as we call it, WAVE program, a new program to identify, restore, and recognize the accomplishments of women artists and artisans. And research is an essential component of the WAVE program to recover the history, the lives of the objects of Venice's women artists, and We are currently developing a reserve to ensure that this work can continue. Please contact the Save Venice office either by email or by phone if you're interested in supporting wave research. And Save Venice particularly wants to thank the Diane Apostolos Capadona Trust in memory, excuse me, of her mother, Stacia Apostolos, for being such an important pioneering supporter of the WAVE Research Fund. Thanks to your generosity, we're already really making some important strides in setting up a digital research portal for the program, as well as hoping to publish a volume of the talks that we have heard on the subject, both in these webinars and at our sessions for Renaissance Society in Dublin. So thank you again, everyone, Sheila in particular, for being with us today. This concludes our spring education series, and the webinars and in-person events sponsored by Save Venice will resume again in fall of 2022, and that lineup will be announced later this summer. So thank you all. I wish everyone well, and I know that you will eagerly go out and look forward to the new artists that you're now becoming familiar with as some wonderful figures to enjoy. Thank you all.